If it's Monday, breaking news. Former President Trump has just arrived in New York City to face criminal charges against him ahead of an historic day in court tomorrow. Plus, another Republican presidential hopeful joins the 2024 race, and unlike his rivals, he's calling for Trump to step aside as an independent group's third-party plans are raising eyebrows and concerns on both sides of the aisle. And exclusive, NBC News reporting on the intel the Chinese spy balloon was able to gather despite the White House's attempts to block it. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington as we cover the breaking news happening right now in New York City. We are in the midst of an historic moment here, folks. Former President Donald Trump has just arrived at LaGuardia Airport, this taken just moments ago. He's in New York to face criminal charges against him, the first time ever a former U.S. president has been indicted. The former president is heading with a police escort from the airport to Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. And tomorrow, Mr. Trump will be processed at the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where he's expected to face about 30 charges. It all relates to hush money payments former Trump fixer Michael Cohen says he made to an adult film star on Trump's behalf. Those charges remain under seal, so we don't know what they are yet. But Mr. Trump's attorney says he's preparing for what he describes as battle.
He's gearing up for a battle. This is something that obviously we believe is a political persecution, and I think people on both sides of the aisle believe that it's a complete abuse of power. He's a tough guy, George, as you know, and he's someone who's going to be ready for this fight. We're ready for this fight, and I look forward to moving this thing along as quickly as possible to exonerate him.
So we are looking at live pictures now, again, of former President Trump traveling through Manhattan, set to arrive in Midtown Manhattan at Trump Tower. We will continue to bring you these images as we continue our coverage. We learned late this afternoon that Mr. Trump has hired a new attorney to take on this case. We also learned that Trump's legal team is opposing a request from the media to have cameras in court. Immediately after that court appearance tomorrow, the former president is set to return to Florida, where he's scheduled to speak for Mar-a-Lago tomorrow night. Now, overnight, Mr. Trump lashed out on social media, demanding a new judge and new venue. All of this comes after Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's predecessor, Cy Vance, told Chuck yesterday on Meet the Press the former president's rhetoric could land him in even more legal peril.
Well, I've got to say that I was disturbed to hear the former president speak in the way he spoke about the District Attorney Bragg and even the trial court in the past week. And I think if I were his lawyer, and believe me, no one is called up to ask for my advice, I would be mindful of not committing some other criminal offense like obstruction of governmental administration, which is interfering with or by threat or otherwise the operation of government. I think that could take what perhaps we think is not the strongest case. When you add a count like that, put it in front of a jury.
On the ground outside the courthouse in Manhattan is Gabe Gutierrez, and Vaughn Hilliard is in West Palm Beach, Florida. Gabe, I have to start to you. Mr. Trump, of course, just landed in New York ahead of the arraignment tomorrow. We are tracking his motorcade as it travels to Trump Tower, bringing folks the live images. Talk to me a little bit about tomorrow. What is the choreography? What are we expecting?
Yeah, Kristen, good afternoon. I'm watching those live pictures right along with you. And yes, several minutes ago, it was the former president that landed at LaGuardia, now making his way to Midtown Manhattan, the Trump Tower, where he's expected to overnight. And for those of you unfamiliar with New York, on a good day with no traffic, it should take about 20 or 30 minutes to make for the motorcade to make its way to Trump Tower. Several of the streets around Trump Tower have been closed off, heavy security presence there, and also here in Lower Manhattan, where I'm at and where the former president is expected to be arraigned tomorrow afternoon around 2:15. Now, again, The former president expected to overnight at Trump Tower, then be driven here sometime around midday tomorrow. Some of that timetable is still very fluid, but the NYPD on high alert, both in Midtown Manhattan, about 4 miles north from where I am, and also right here in front of the courthouse where the former president is expected to be arraigned on the 15th floor. Now, we are still trying to find out whether a mugshot might be taken here. We understand he will be processed. No DNA swab will be taken, we're told by sources, but he will be fingerprinted. And Kristen, as you mentioned, there is still this legal battle playing out right now on whether the judge will allow cameras in the courtroom. Just a short time ago, we got that legal filing from the Trump team saying that cameras in the courtroom, in their opinion, would contribute to a, quote, circus-like atmosphere. Well, I can't tell you, Kristen, this already has some feelings of a circus-like atmosphere here in Lower Manhattan. There's quite a security presence here. Just a short time ago, there were a small altercation between two people. The NYPD swooped right in, took them into custody. They are on very high alert, especially, Kristen, because of the threats against the district attorney's office here over the last several weeks, several dozen serious threats against DA Alvin Bragg. And so the NYPD, again, looking at this very closely. But tomorrow, after the arraignment, the former president then expected to get back on a plane and head back towards West Palm Beach or Palm Beach and speak at Mar-a-Lago, Kristen.
And Gabe, as you are talking, we continue to watch these extraordinary images of the Trump motorcade getting closer to Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. Garrett Haake has been reporting that he is traveling with his campaign team, a number of members of his campaign staff, top aides to the former president who are going to work with him on his effort for re-election. And of course, there are some real security concerns, all of which you talked about, Gabe. How much of the timing of this is because of those security concerns?
Well, this has been choreographed now for several days, Kristen, and we've been trying to report out the exact timetable of this, and even at this late hour, the day before the arraignment, we still don't know several key details, whether it be exactly how much of a glimpse we will catch of the former president as he comes to this building. We understand, several streets might be shut down. However, most of this building behind me will be shut down for what will be a very short proceeding. Arraignments typically take only, 2, 3, maybe 5 minutes, but the entire building will essentially be shut down because of those security concerns. So we don't know what exactly we will see. It's unlikely we will get, what's commonly referred to as some sort of perp walk. Of course, the Secret Service in heavy consultation with the NYPD, trying to make this so that the former president is brought here safely. Certainly, an unprecedented situation that this has not been done before. However, the NYPD is in a unique position to help with this because they are so used to transporting high-level dignitaries, especially, for example, the UN General Assembly happens here every year. If any law enforcement agency can do this, it's the NYPD. However, Mayor Eric Adams earlier today said the city is so far tracking no specific credible threats. Kristen?
Really important detail there, Gabe. And President Biden was just asked about this as well. He said he has confidence in the NYPD to handle whatever comes their way tomorrow. Vaughn, let me turn to you, and Gabe, stick around if you would. Vaughn, you obviously have been tracking all things Trump world. We know that the former president was lashing out on his social media site overnight. I spoke to a source close to the former president who acknowledged, look, these next couple of days are going to be tough. But obviously, he's also been pretty defiant. Take us inside Mar-a-Lago, inside Trump world. What's the thinking?
Right. This is the same playbook that Donald Trump has played for years now, not only against the media, making the idea of fake news a mainstay among the right wing, and then to take on Robert Mueller, to take on the impeachment proceedings against him, to take on the January 6th Select Committee. It is an effort to undermine the credibility and the legitimacy, at least in the millions of supporters of his eyes. Of course, we have seen in 2020 election and the 2022 midterms when it it comes to a general election electorate, difficulty in getting sympathy from a greater part of the electorate to some of that mantra. But this go around, you see Donald Trump again trying to consolidate that support here on the Republican end of this. He has raised, since the indictment came down on Thursday night, according to one of his top aides, more than $7 million for his campaign. And he is using this as an opportunity to try to also apply pressure to the likes of Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, both of whom came out in his defense, underscoring the idea that this is prosecutorial misconduct. For Donald Trump, this is about trying to use this moment in the reality that he has a criminal trial before him and a jury that will ultimately be the one to determine whether to convict him or not. I'll just say, Kristen, I think it's important to point out that his defense attorneys are trying to bar cameras from inside of the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, Donald Trump, unless he were to take the witness stand, does not have the microphone. Where he will have the microphone is tomorrow night when he returns to Mar-a-Lago, when he intends to make primetime remarks at 8:15 p.m. Eastern time, using his private club as the backdrop. And we would assume we will take that opportunity to try to undercut the investigation and the potential criminal proceedings into him.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. And Vaughn, as we are listening to all of your great reporting, we are watching the Trump motorcade get closer to Trump Tower. Vaughn, you talk about the strategy so well, and I'm reminded that this is not just a former president, he's a former reality TV star, right? He understands the power of these images to use that to turn them around for his potential political gain. And I really look at this in two buckets. It's the short term, where he is sucking up a lot of the oxygen in the primary, but then there's the long term, when it could get more complicated, starting with debates, when some of the people who are defending him right now may not be inclined to do so once they have to come face to face with him. And Vaughn, we're getting a much closer look at the motorcade now, turning the corner there, getting much closer to Trump Tower. I'm not sure exactly what street that is, but you obviously see the big police presence. Vaughn?
Right. I think that it's the Quinnipiac poll that came out here at the end of last week that I think is notable when answering that question. Among Republican voters nationally, 75% of them said that if Donald Trump were to be criminally charged, they would not believe those criminal charges to be disqualifying of him as a presidential candidate. 75% of Republicans nationally. But when you open up that polling question to all voters across the country, a majority of them said that they did believe that it was disqualifying of Donald Trump. And that's where you get at the heart of the difference between ascending to the Republican nomination and then ultimately winning a general election in November of 2024. And for Donald Trump, yes, he had a reality TV show coming out of this year. But for Donald Trump, there is a reality that is very difficult, and that is that coming from these courtroom proceedings, we will learn evidence, we will learn details that likely Republicans will have an easier time pointing to if they do intend to ultimately flip, because it is not going to be a he said, she said. You're likely to hear from key witnesses who had direct conversations with Donald Trump, not only in this case, but if there were to be charges brought in Fulton County or by the special counsel.
Let me interrupt you very quickly. We have a picture of former President Trump walking into Trump Tower. He waved to his supporters who are standing outside of Trump Tower. So just to put a fine point on this, former President Trump now inside Trump Tower in Lower Manhattan. Vaughn, apologies for interrupting you. Please continue.
No, and I think that this is the part when you're talking about Trump Tower, that was base camp. That was where not only he called home, but he also operated his 2016, 2015 Trump campaign out of there. And there were many Republicans that regretted in 2016 not taking on Donald Trump until it became, in so many of their own words, in 2016, too late. Ted Cruz, who was his chief Republican rival, waited there until it was past the Iowa caucus to really try to take on Donald Trump head on. And the issue was that on May 3rd, 2016, when Ted Cruz dropped out of that presidential race against Donald Trump, he used the words amoral, a serial philanderer, a lot of those very personal attacks. And at that point, the primary election was already pretty solid. And so now For Donald Trump, this is about drawing attention. You know, there are 9 months until we get to the Iowa caucus here. But right now, national polls indicate that he is up by 30 percentage points nationally. And those numbers are not lost on anybody. And that's why Asa Hutchinson is a unique candidate jumping into this race this weekend here to really try to draw that contrast. And he makes the claim that this DA's indictment of him should force Donald Trump out of the race. Of course, it's not. But the question here is there going to be Republican pressure elsewhere outside of Asa Hutchinson?
Yeah, that will be a big question, Vaughn. You're absolutely right about that. I want to go to Dasha Burns right now, who is outside Trump Tower. Dasha, set the scene. What is it like to be there? You're really in the center of it.
Yeah, this is a moment that the crowds here have been waiting for, frankly, all day. Kristen, we've had people come up to us, tourists. You know, this is Midtown Manhattan. There are a lot of folks here all day throughout the day, and they've been coming up to us asking, what is going on? Where is the former president? When is he landing here? Well, he is going to arrive here at Trump Tower at any moment now, and just about everyone on the street right now has their cell phone out. They are recording what is happening. Crowds are building across the street from Trump Tower here. We're catty corner just on the other side of the street and diagonal from Trump Tower. And across the street, there is a massive crowd of onlookers right now. There are some police helicopters circling around above here right now. And everyone seems to be ready to record, to be here to witness this unprecedented
and Dasha,
moment.
Dasha, as you're speaking, I should tell you, he actually just walked in moments ago. We saw him walk in. We saw him wave. And I know the anticipation, as you point out, has just been growing throughout the day. But there are some real security concerns. Gabe was talking about this earlier. Talk about the concerns about potential protests and how that relates to what you're seeing right now.
And thank you for letting me know, Kristen. We've just been observing what's going on around us here. Yeah, that's exactly right. Security has been paramount. The mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, held a security briefing earlier and said that NYPD is prepared. He said that there is no credible threat to the city right now, but that certainly they are on high alert. He had a stern warning for what he called any rabble-rousers who are planning to come here to air any grievances or to stir anything up. He told everyone to come here, exercise your First Amendment right, but behave yourselves, keep calm, peacefully protest. That is the expectation that he has set for folks here. But of course, NYPD is prepared to handle any sorts of issues that come up. They are out in full force. We can tell you that's certainly what we've seen here. A lot of police presence, a lot of barricades. But also, Kristen, it is going to be a challenge because there are a lot of people here anticipating what's going to happen over the next 12 to 24 hours. A lot of media, a lot of onlookers. And tomorrow, while we haven't seen a lot of protest action yet here, we do expect that will be the case tomorrow. Kristen?
Yeah, and we can just see the unbelievable scene behind you as it's unfolding, Dasha. We see a lot of Trump protesters, people holding up Trump signs, American flags. And Dasha, as you were talking, we replayed former President Trump entering Trump Tower again. He waved to his supporters, walked in. He has been striking a note of defiance every day since this indictment has been announced, and so we anticipate we will hear more of that same tone when we hear from him tomorrow night. Let me bring in now NBC senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett, and also with me Carol Lamb, a former federal prosecutor and an NBC News legal analyst. Thanks to both of you for being here, for joining us. Laura, let me start with you. We do not know what these specific charges are yet, right? I mean, we know there are more than 30. What are you going to be watching for tomorrow? What are your big questions?
The big question is, what is the evidence that the prosecutor has to support the charges that we believe have to do with falsifying business records? That's a charge that is typically a misdemeanor. And in order to elevate it to a felony, where we're talking about actual jail time on the line, Kristen, it has to be in connection with furthering or trying to conceal a second crime. And so my big question is, what is that second crime? What is the district attorney's hook here for trying to charge the former president in the United States with a felony? Is it some state election law crime? Is it a federal campaign violation? Is it conspiracy? We just don't know, and we don't have the visibility into what's in the indictment. But that's going to be a key question, because it will help us understand the stakes here, and will help us understand what is the theory of the case that the prosecutors are going to bring against him.
Carol Lam, let me turn to you, because Laura maps out a legal strategy that some legal analysts have said is risky. This is untested in some ways. How risky is this strategy to bring whatever these charges may be against the former president?
The one thing that prosecutors really don't like is to do things that are unprecedented. We like to have well-worn paths where the judge's rulings are going to be predictable, and more importantly, the appellate court's rulings are going to be predictable. When I heard the reports that there were more than 30 charges in the indictment, it got me thinking that what this district attorney has done, and I tend to agree with his approach, is probably to charge former President Trump's actions in every which way possible. Let me explain what I mean by that. He may have done a few things. He paid hush money. He repaid Michael Cohen, who had already paid hush money to Stormy Daniels. But what this district attorney likely did, and we will know in 24 hours, thankfully, what he likely did was charge it in a number of ways. So what Laura was referring to, what is going to create the felony here? Maybe it's violation of state election law. Maybe it's violation of a federal election law. Maybe it's a tax charge. And it's that last charge that I'm going to be particularly interested in seeing whether it's charged, because I think that could be the cleaner case. It could be the case that's most removed from politics here. And this district attorney can actually charge all of those things, plus a conspiracy count. And that's important as well, because a conspiracy count would allow the district attorney to get in certain types of evidence about the acts of co-conspirators who may not be charged. They may be uncharged co-conspirators in the indictment, but it allows the district attorney to put in more evidence about what the actual charge was. Now, let me get back to the tax charge or the potential tax charge for a minute, because when the Trump Organization, presumably at Donald Trump's direction, repaid Michael Cohen, they repaid him not just the $130,000 that went to Stormy Daniels, but they gave him a bonus, and they gave him an extra amount of money to pay the taxes that they anticipated he was going to pay on that $130,000. So what that means is that the Trump Organization, and presumably Donald Trump, anticipated the filing of false tax returns. So I'm going to be looking for all of that, because 30 counts in an indictment is a lot. And I think that the district attorney is approaching this in a way that's going to give him the most leverage here.
Well, it will just be fascinating to finally see what is in this indictment. Laura Jarrett, what more do we know about this judge tomorrow?
Somebody who runs a tight ship, which by all accounts, given the spectacle that we have seen play out just in the last couple of hours before he's even actually faced an arraignment, will be important here. I specifically asked people who had appeared in front of him whether he was likely to issue a gag order, which would be an order barring the former president or his attorneys or even witnesses from talking publicly about the case. Obviously, that would be a huge move, especially considering that the defendant here is actually running for public office to be the next president of the United States. So prohibiting him from talking on the campaign about this would be an enormously consequential move. And some of the people that I spoke with, former prosecutors who've appeared in front of Judge Merchan, said he may not do that. But what he may do instead is you see him issue sort of a warning shot to the former president, an admonishment of sorts to say, basically, be be on notice that I'm watching, and if you keep talking, you do so at your peril. Now, other people I spoke to said the judge may not say anything at all and simply just let him talk. Everything he's saying right now can be used against him, and so even the district attorney may just want to just let him talk and see what he's likely to say if completely unrestricted. Obviously, making any threats would be a different issue and would be handled in a completely different way, Kristen.
Von Hilliard, let me have you pick up on the point that Laura makes. How is he being advised by his attorneys? We have seen him lashing out. As Laura says, rightfully, anything he says can be used against him. So this can be incredibly risky for him to speak out on social media.
Right. And the issue here is if they were to try to seek a gag order, you're silencing not only a former president of the United States, but also a presidential candidate who is up by anywhere from 20 to 30 percentage points nationally. But when you look at this here, Donald Trump, I think it's important to note, in all of these individual cases, he has different counsel working on them. In Georgia, from this case to the special counsel's cases, the Mar-a-Lago documents case, he does have Boris Epshteyn, who is sort of leading the coordination of the lawyers that are representing Donald Trump. But this is a moment here in which you are seeing the former president, who is obviously only taken counsel to a certain degree throughout the course of his own presidency, but also it's playing out. He's not only attacking Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg on a social media post, but also attacking the judge here, Justice Merchan, the acting Supreme Court justice, and suggesting that he is overnight, quote, Trump hating. Of course, there's no evidence of that, but this is somebody who also, he's not naive to the fact that in Alan Weisselberg, the Trump Organization's CFO, in his case, who Alan Weisselberg struck a plea agreement with prosecutors in the Manhattan District Attorney's office, but the justice was the same one who oversaw that plea agreement and the sentencing of Alan Weisselberg to 5 months at Rikers jail. And so Donald Trump is not naive to that. But when you're also talking about him trying to change the venues here, right? This is Donald Trump at least trying to, despite whatever counsel may be suggesting to him, his own attorney, Joe Tacopino, said that this judge was not biased yesterday, in his opinion. So Donald Trump does what he does. His own counsel will try to do what they do.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Gabe, let me give you the final word here. You have been obviously standing outside the courthouse. We see outside Trump Tower, people are already gathering on both sides. Those who support Trump, those who think that this indictment is a good thing. How is the city preparing for the potential protests tomorrow?
Well, Kristen, I will say I've been here out in front of the courthouse now for several weeks. There's only been a smattering of people here that have protested this one way or the other. The last crowd that we saw, a very small, few dozen people on that day that the former president called for protests, pretty much fizzled. Now, I have spoken with the organizers for tomorrow's scheduled protests. They do expect a bigger crowd, partly because they say it will be headlined by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, obviously a lightning rod, and they are publicizing the location of this rally. But it remains to be seen exactly how many people that will draw. Still, I think the NYPD recognizes the potential for a crowd. They want to be prepared either way. But what has been concerning, Kristen, is, let's put this in a big picture, how unusual it is for a defendant in any type of case to make what are essentially threats or attacks, verbal attacks, on a district attorney. And that has really played out over the last several weeks. And there was one social media posting you'll recall, Kristen, that was the former President Trump holding a bat, and that image was near an image of District Attorney Bragg. That post was later deleted. And, some of those posts have been called ill-advised by the former president's own attorneys. But there have been serious threats, several dozen over the last several weeks. The NYPD looking at this very closely. And one last point I'll make, Kristen, it's unclear exactly whether we will get any clean video shots of the president coming into this courthouse. The Secret Service and the NYPD may make it hard for journalists to get that shot. A lot of it's still up in the air, the timing. But again, we expect that arraignment sometime around 2:15 tomorrow afternoon, Kristen.
Yeah, there's no doubt it will be quite a scene. Thank you for starting us off, to all of you. Fantastic conversation. Again, former President Trump is at Trump Tower as we speak. Gabe Gutierrez, Von Hilliard, Dasha Burns, Laura Jarrett, Carol Lamb, thank you all for getting us started. We really appreciate it. Great conversation. Coming up, more on what to expect as Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and former President Trump's defense team prepare for a legal showdown. Plus, the political impact of this historic indictment. Many of Trump's potential primary rivals rallying to his defense without even knowing the details of the charges. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Former President Trump has arrived at Trump Tower ahead of his arraignment tomorrow. And as we wait for the indictment to be unsealed, questions are growing about what Mr. Trump is actually being charged with and how exactly prosecutors plan to prove their case. Chuck asked both Michael Cohen's lawyer, Lanny Davis, and former Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance about the tough road ahead for Bragg. Take a listen.
Is this an airtight case in your mind, or is this going to be a tough case?
So it's not going to be an easy case because they do have to create a novel law.
Is there any doubt in your mind that this case is airtight?
Well, I do not know if this case is airtight or not. I know that the DA's office has extremely experienced and seasoned lawyers. This is, the charges that might be involved here are certainly well within their experience level and their trial experience level.
Joining me now is Jeremy Salon, former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney in the Trial Division. He currently works as a criminal defense attorney. Thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You just heard Cy Vance and Lanny Davis essentially say they can't say for sure it's airtight. Can Bragg really afford to bring a case against a former president that's not airtight?
Well, I think you have to start with the premise that not every case is airtight. And sometimes you pursue a case because you believe it's just, you believe the law points to it, and that's what we should do. But it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Sometimes you take those cases that you lose. That being said, here, you would expect that there'd be that extra precaution because a loss, meaning an acquittal, is something that the public can interpret worse than egg on the face, but as something that was more political from the onset. So it should be a concern, but I have no doubt they've also done their homework to put them in the best place possible to secure that conviction.
Let me follow up with you on that point. I mean, obviously you've, worked in the DA's office. What can you tell us about how they might approach this type of a case, given the high stakes?
Well, there's a lot of background issues that they no doubt address first. We've heard this routinely already. Was there a statute of limitations issue? It is somewhat novel if the premise of the bump up, if we will, from the misdemeanor to the felony is something from a federal crime or a campaign finance issue, as opposed to a state issue. Well, then that's something that they must have vetted thoroughly because they wouldn't find themselves here. Keep in mind, too, there may be other charges. Just because it's a 30-some-odd count indictment, as we understand, there could be a conspiracy charge. I mentioned previously and blogged about it, there could be a criminal tax fraud charge. So there's a lot of different things that are in the air, and I wish I could tell you more, but we're all dying like you are to see what's in that indictment.
Yeah, we certainly are. That's for sure. Let me play something that Bill Barr told Fox News over the weekend. I want to get your reaction on the other side.
I'm not his lawyer. Generally, I think it's a bad idea to go on the stand, and I think it's particularly a bad idea for Trump because he lacks all self-control, and it'd be very difficult to prepare him and keep him testifying in a prudent fashion.
So there was the former attorney general when asked if Mr. Trump should be on the stand. What do you make of that, and do you think there's any scenario where Mr. Trump's lawyers would put him on the stand?
There's certainly a scenario where someone in this situation would want to testify and relying on the advice of counsel to responding to Michael Cohen. But I think if you took Bill Barr's quote and you stamp that everywhere, that would be a very fair assessment. Donald Trump is not your average witness. And by average, I'm not talking about a president being not average and atypical. I'm talking about someone who would be difficult to control, and you really would be fearful that he'd impeach himself by continuing to speak and say the wrong things. He is not a great witness. He's not someone who can be controlled. If I was a prosecutor, I would love a shot at him because you could probably get him off that sort of Colonel Jessup way of saying something that he should not be saying.
His lawyer, Joe Tacopina, has said that they plan to challenge the charges despite not knowing what exactly the charges are. Walk us through what that would look like. How long could this process stretch out?
So a typical case, if there's such a thing, in Supreme Court once there's an indictment. Usually you're on about a month to 2 months later to file motions or a response from certain motions that you may file. And then it starts to move on quickly. Remember, under New York discovery law, the DA's office, to be ready for trial, have to turn over the entire scope of this discovery. So whereas a normal case, if there's such a thing, maybe 3 to 6 months or so, I would expect this case would likely expand and go beyond a year, because every angle that they can do and pursue to challenge us, whether it's the grand jury minutes, whether it's a statute of limitations, whether it's just the facial sufficiency of the indictment, there is going to be a challenge. There's going to be a wrench thrown into this process.
Jeremy, one more before I let you go. The former president is asking for a new venue. Is that realistic? Do you expect that that's going to happen? He's arguing he can't get a fair trial in Manhattan.
I've heard that. I've heard also he wants to go to Staten Island because it's more favorable potentially in terms of a Republican, more of a stronger Republican base. I think that's just more noise. I don't imagine the judge agreeing to that, or any party agreeing to that for that matter.
All right, Jeremy Salon, thank you so much for your insights. We really appreciate it. Mr. Trump is, of course, an active candidate for president, and his campaign says it raised more than $7 million since the news of the indictment came out. And at the same time, the 2024 Republican presidential primary field is getting bigger. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson joined the primary yesterday, telling ABC News he will formally announce his campaign later this month. Now, unlike the rest of the announced candidates in the field, Hutchinson has been critical of Donald Trump's legal situation, saying Mr. Trump should drop out of the race amid this indictment. Look.
Do you believe that now that he's been indicted, should he drop out?
Well, I do. First of all, the office is more important than any individual person. And so for the sake of the office of the presidency, I do think that's too much of a sideshow and distraction.
Joining me now on set is Mariana Sotomayor, congressional reporter for The Washington Post, Democratic strategist and NBC News political analyst Juanita Tolliver, and Republican strategist and NBC News political analyst Rick Tyler. Thanks to all of you for being here. We certainly have no shortage of things to discuss today. Mariana, let me start with you. Look, this is extraordinary. The former president has convinced most of his rivals, save Asa Hutchinson, to close ranks around him, to rally behind him, to go after the DA in this indictment that he's facing. In the short term, he's been emboldened. There's no doubt about that. But is this sustainable?
I mean, there are a number of other investigations about him, right? So there are some discussions of when could that be the breaking point for these other candidates. We won't really know, right? And I think tomorrow will be very interesting when we look at all the counts and all of those charges. What exactly did he do, right? I don't know if that means that these candidates are all of a sudden going to flip the script. Maybe some who have been critical will be more critical, but those little things are still going to come out. And I think just how these candidates respond, it's going to be interesting.
Rick, let me go to you on that point. I've been talking to some of the people with the various campaigns, and they're saying, look, this case is not like the other cases he is potentially facing. They're more straightforward. They're more serious in terms of the jail time that they carry. Do you think, as Mariana says, we might see a shift in strategy from a Ron DeSantis?
They have no idea, because they have no idea what's in the indictment. So we'll know tomorrow what's in the indictment, and we can predict what they're going to say about it. I think that the losing strategy is to just treat Donald Trump with some deference and defend him on this, because then you're playing into his media game. Donald Trump has played, to use the game show or reality show analogy a little further, he has been playing this game his entire life. He was a game show host, a reality TV host, but now it's flipped a little bit. Although when you watch the motorcade come in, you're sending the signal is that this is somebody different. This is an important person. Most people who are brought up on arraignment charges don't have a motorcade meet their airplane at the airport. But tomorrow he doesn't write the script. He's not his own producer. He's not his own script writer. He's not his own writer. He will not control it. He will be in an ordinary arraignment, just like many other people who are indicted, and that may change. So in terms of all the potential candidates, if you were ever thinking of running for president, this should be your last time, you ought to get in, because you do not know what will happen. Nobody knows what is going to happen.
Yeah, that is for sure. I want to put up this new CNN poll, which shows a majority of Americans approve of the arrest of the former president, but a greater majority says politics played a role in the arrest. again, we don't know, Juanita, what these charges are, but what do you make of this when you see these staggering numbers?
I think what it shows is that, one, people are relying on him to be held accountable, first and foremost. The majority of the country is there. I think when they're saying politics played a role, I don't think it's the same way that Trump's saying it, right? Like, they're saying this in a different sense that does not feed into some of the tones that he's been offering up, or the charges, or let's be real, lies he's been telling about D.A. Bragg. Like, that's not what's happening there. Maybe for the Republican base. And I want to go back to something Mariana mentioned about a breaking point, potentially. I don't see a breaking point because the other poll that I've been watching is the fact that the lead between Trump and DeSantis has grown from 8 points to 26.
Yeah,
right? That is the other part here that shows me that whatever's in the indictment or what isn't there is not going to change what his base of supporters want to see from him.
Yeah, Mariana, let me let you jump in. I mean, I had so many conversations this weekend where people said this moment is worse for DeSantis because not only has he failed to distinguish himself from Trump from a policy perspective, but now he's one of his chief defenders.
Absolutely. And you really have seen DeSantis try and find himself. He's obviously been able to really reign in Florida. You can very much put it that way. He has a lot of support. He has a lot of support from even independents in that state. But Florida is so different from any other state.
Truly.
And Trump really does have a support out there, even though, the midterms did teach us that there are some Republicans out there who said, I don't want this kind of extremism. I don't want those kind of Trump-endorsed candidates. Yeah. But this has been a rallying cry for Trump. And for those who are trying to model themselves but not be Trump, it's very awkward terrain.
Yeah, Rick, here's how David Frum wrote about this in The Atlantic. He says the DeSantis campaign has been built on an impossible contradiction. His message to his party was, I offer you Trump's style minus Trump's scandals. That offer only made sense on the assumption that Trump's scandals were bad. Yet when any major new Trump scandal has erupted, DeSantis has jumped to deny or defend it. Is this a smart strategy for DeSantis? And like, how does he reclaim the oxygen in the spotlight?
Well, that's the whole point. DeSantis needs to define what his candidacy would potentially mean. And it can't be a reaction to Trump, whether I'm more like Trump or I'm not like Trump in this ways. All of that is Trump-centric. He has to get to a campaign that is DeSantis-centric. And so far, right now, he was doing a fairly good job, but I'd say he's failing at that now.
What strikes me is that it seemed like the lesson of 2016 was if you want to go after Trump, you have to go directly at him. Juanita, we're just not seeing that with any of the candidates.
Not yet. Asa Hutchinson is trying. I'll give him that. He's the only one who's called out some of Trump's liabilities, and he's doing it consistently. He's saying on principle, which is novel coming from a Republican. I appreciate it, but it's not going to cut through that noise. It's not going to cut through the oxygen when Trump is seeing gains in spite of these indictments.
President Biden really not weighing in on this as well, basically saying I'm not going to weigh in on an ongoing criminal matter. But I've talked to some of his allies who say that's not sustainable.
I don't think it's sustainable fully, but let's be real. The president has been explicitly clear to not engage in any action from the justice system. He's going to do that even more when if the DOJ comes forward with an indictment. So brace yourselves for it. It might be a little rocky road. Eventually he will get there, but not in the early days.
All right, I want to shift gears a little bit and play some sound from Senator Manchin with Chuck yesterday on Meet the Press when he left the possibility open that he could run as a third-party candidate. Take a look.
When you're asking me what I'm going to do and what my political ambitions would be, is to make the country work together and be a united states and not to divided states. And that's what I've seen happen over the period of time. I'm going to do whatever I can to have a voice in that middle.
And when you hear people say that you might be a spoiler if you run for president, what would you say to that?
I would never intend to be a spoiler of anything.
Mariana, some alarm bells are going off about comments like that. The No Labels group getting closer to saying, yes, we are very serious about finding a third-party candidate. They cite the fact that polls are higher than ever before for the possibility of a third-party candidate. But, of course, that doesn't take into account specific names. What do you make of a potential third-party candidate?
I mean, it's not something that Democrats want to see at all.
At all. Heavy head
Actually,
shake.
or Republicans. The Trump people are a little nervous about it, too.
Right, because it could, I mean, not even could, it will pull away voters. And we've seen that throughout other presidential elections, too. And, I mean, with Biden in particular, you do have a lot of people who worry about his age. You have Republicans who also think the same about Trump. I think that is fueling a lot of this. Well, who else is it going to be? And no labels in particular, very much saying, you know, we don't want anyone extreme left. We don't want anyone extreme right. I'm sure the Biden administration and or future campaign will argue they are not that left. But there are people there who are just wanting to know. I don't want Biden. I don't want Trump and or all these other Republicans. Who could it be?
Alarm bells are going off on both sides, Juanita.
Absolutely. Like, let's be real. Democrats know any chance of a loss of voters, like, implodes the 2024 election for them. And what I do appreciate in the write-up in the Washington Post is that when prompted with that question, the reps from No Label had no answer. They didn't want to touch it. They don't want to accept the reality of them being spoilers.
So thousands of independent parties have come and gone. This may or may not be different. The polling does show this is it is a unique opportunity. I don't think Joe Manchin is it. I think the base of his own party is very, very angry with him. And so I'm not sure that he would be the spoiler in this race.
All right. Well, a lot to watch. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it to kick off a very busy week. Mariana, Juanita, and Rick, appreciate it. After the break, NBC News exclusive reporting on the Chinese spy balloon and the intelligence secrets Beijing was able to gather in real time, despite Washington's best defense. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. NBC News has exclusive reporting about the Chinese spy balloon that flew over the U.S. just over 2 months ago and potentially raising new national security concerns. 3 U.S. officials tell NBC News, despite efforts to block it, the balloon was able to gather intelligence from several sensitive military sites and transmit that information back to Beijing in real time. Joining me now on set is the reporter, my colleague, who broke that story, NBC News managing editor for Washington, Carol Lee. Carol, thank you for being here. You and Courtney Cubie had this great exclusive. So what were the key takeaways for you?
So I think, Kristen, it's that this balloon hovered over the U.S. for a week. We all knew that. The administration at the time said they had moved things around, potential intelligence gathering targets on the ground. They had tried to obscure the balloon from being able to collect intelligence. But what we've learned is that the balloon did indeed collect intelligence, and some very sensitive intelligence. It was largely electronic signals types of intelligence, and it was able to do that and transmit it back to China in real time. And so we also know that there was a self-destruct mechanism in the balloon. And so China could have remotely activated that. That didn't happen. The U.S. doesn't quite know exactly why, whether they tried to and it didn't work out, or whether they just decided to leave it linger, because what we're told it was doing, Kristen, is doing even figure 8 formations over some of these sensitive military sites and just scooping things up.
It's just incredible because, of course, at the time, the administration was very defensive about the way that they handled this. And one of the controversial things was the fact that they allowed it to basically travel across the U.S. before they shot it down. Are they standing by that decision? And how much concern is there that this is a real national security threat?
They are standing by that decision, which won't surprise you. They're pretty dug in on it, and basically make the argument that whatever China got, it could have been a lot worse. They took steps to mitigate them from being able to get more, and at the same time, it was kind of a two-way street. So with a wink and a nod, they're like, well, we learned a lot too. And that they were able to monitor the balloon as it was traveling across the U.S. And not only that, but also then once it got shot down off the coast of South Carolina, they gathered all of the debris and have pieced it back together and are studying it and looking at it and learning a lot about China's capabilities.
Well, you and Courtney have been just out front on all of this reporting, so thank you for that. Let me ask you about something else that I know you're watching today. We're all covering this week. Speaker McCarthy announced today that he is, in fact, going to meet with the president of Taiwan. China has already threatened some form of retaliation. The White House is trying to downplay that. What are you hearing? What's the White House saying today about this?
So one of the things they're saying, which is interesting when you look at this, is that it's not a visit. It's a transit. So the president of Taiwan just happens to be passing through. It's not as if it's something intentional. And that's designed to really just downplay it. There's a lot of concern in the administration that this is something that's going to escalate tensions with China. This administration currently is going to great lengths to not escalate tensions with China. Things have gotten so bad after the balloon incident, and then the questions about whether China was going to send lethal aid to Russia for use in Ukraine. There was a lot of fire breathing on either side, a lot of public comments. And right now, the White House's position is they want to downplay that. And so they don't want this to turn into something that could really escalate.
Yeah, and of course, there was a big backlash after former House Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, and they're concerned about that same thing. Carol Lee, thank you for covering all the angles for us today. Really appreciate it. Great to see you. Still to come, countdown to Election Day. Wisconsin and Chicago voters will hit the polls tomorrow for a number of key races with national impact. We'll tell you what to watch for. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Tomorrow is Election Day, and two races that we're watching very closely because of what they could tell us about the national landscape, and two issues that will be key in 2024, crime and abortion. In Chicago, two Democrats are facing off in a mayoral race where crime has become the central issue. Paul Vallis, the moderate former chief of Chicago Public Schools, is endorsed by the city's police union and vowed to ramp up policing, while Brandon Johnson, a progressive, has had to defend his past calls to defund the police. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, voters will elect the next member of the state's Supreme Court in an election that will, in all likelihood, determine the future of abortion access in the state. And if it's Monday, it's Amy Walter, publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report, who is joining me. Amy, thanks for being here on a very busy Monday. Oh, my goodness. So let's talk about these races in Chicago and Wisconsin. What are you going to be watching for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Wisconsin one is the most interesting, in part because, well, it's a partisan race. Now, it's actually on paper not partisan. They do not run with party labels, but it's a conservative versus a liberal candidate. And as you pointed out, the balance of the Supreme Court is at stake here. And so what could be really interesting to watch on the same day, of course, we're spending a lot of our time and attention looking at Donald Trump, is whether or not the issue of Donald Trump is going to, in his indictment, is going to have an impact on this race. Now, in some ways, you'd say, well, why would it have an impact on a local race in Wisconsin? Well, Republicans hoping maybe to see some turnout, some enthusiasm from their base. Democrats have been feeling pretty optimistic about their chances to win this race. But with the attention now going to Donald Trump, and especially, as you all pointed out in your earlier segment, all of the energy among his base, the sense that he's being wronged, might make things, they're a little more unstable when it comes to understanding turnout. The other thing, and you pointed to abortion, that's exactly right, are the two issues that really defined elections in 2022, Trump and abortion, going to continue to benefit the Democratic Party. And in Wisconsin, it's obviously a battleground state, and it matters a lot.
Well, and to what extent, Amy, and I know you will be watching turnout very closely, how much attention should we give, how much weight should we give to just the turnout?
Just the turnout is really important to appreciate, and especially in this post-Trump era. Greg Gilbert, who's a columnist at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, does great reporting on all things Wisconsin politics. He had a piece the other week pointing out that since Trump was elected, and obviously he won in Wisconsin very narrowly in 2016, of all the statewide races that have taken place, there have been about 8 statewide races, including state Supreme Court races. Democrats have won in 6 of those, Republicans in 2, and those 2 by very, very narrow margins. Obviously, Ron Johnson winning re-election as senator last year, a state Supreme Court in 2019. Democrats, though, seem to have been building a bigger cushion in this Trump era. Suburbs of Milwaukee, Madison, Wisconsin have become really critical to Democrats, and the turnout there is usually incredibly strong. Rural areas, obviously, tilting to Republicans as they are across the country. But in this, again, in this Trump era, those suburban votes outside of Milwaukee that used to be Republican, Dane County, Madison, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, that's helping Democrats a lot.
Interesting. Some eye-popping numbers when you're talking about the money here spent on this race. Again, a statewide race, $28 million in ad spending. What does that tell you?
For a nonpartisan office, for a judge. And they're not really hiding their partisanship or their opinions on issues, including abortion, especially the candidate who's running as the liberal option, Janet Protasiewicz, who's been endorsed by Emily's List, is really leaning into this idea that, you know what, abortion rights or reproductive access is central to this job. That's something that 10, 20 years ago, you would never believe that somebody running to be a justice would have an opinion, or at least make their opinion known on a case that we know is going to come before them.
And we have less than a minute left. Very quickly, what are you watching for in Chicago?
Well, let's see. Crime, you're right, is the critical issue here. We saw this in New York and maybe in Chicago as well, where the more center-left candidate, because of crime, is able to defeat the more progressive candidate, even in an overwhelmingly blue city.
Yeah, and if Brandon Johnson's initial support of defunding the police, even though he's disavowed it now, if he can really shake it.
That's right.
Amy Walter, thank you
so much.
Always
It's great
so
to be
great
with
to
you.
see you. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your insights. You can always get Amy's smart political analysis at cookpolitical.com. Thank you so much for being with us this hour. I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.